Welcome, everybody, to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is CFL insider Dave Naylor. Dave, thanks so much for being on today's episode. I'm really excited to talk Ottawa football and to talk about the rise and fall of many of the CFL stories that you've come across throughout your entire career.
Glad to be here.
So first things first, we were talking a little bit before we started recording here about Ottawa football and how you had covered two different, or I guess now almost going on three Ottawa franchises. You started working in Ottawa after graduating from Carleton, which is in Ottawa as well. So what was your outlook on when you first started covering the CFL in terms of if you really wanted to cover it or what you were expecting to come out of your journalism degree when you finished?
It's funny. I'm 53, so I'm kind of like the last generation of teenagers that grew up in Southern Ontario that really cared when the Argonauts mattered still. I mean, I was 16 when the Argonauts won the 1983 Grey Cup. So, I grew up a CFL fan, but I was an NFL fan. I'm honestly a bigger baseball fan as a teenager and stuff. But I just wanted to cover sports. And when I went to do journalism school at Carleton, 86 to 90, the Rough Riders were going through some rough times then, and I lived right across from the stadium. I mean, my student apartment was like 100-yard walk to the stadium. So we'd always go to games, and the crowds weren't good. The teams were terrible. I covered the 1988 Grey Cup as a student, which was BC and Winnipeg in Ottawa. And that was my first real experience of getting to cover the CFL kind of up close, was being accredited for that Grey Cup as a student journalist. And then when I left Ottawa in 1991, after I spent a year running the student newspaper there, I was hired as a sports intern at the Globe and Mail. And I started on like May the 3rd or something. And that was just, a couple of weeks after, the Toronto Argonauts had upstaged the NFL draft by signing Rocket Ismail, who was the projected number one pick of that draft. The Argos moved in, paid him like more than any receiver in the NFL was making. And instead, the Dallas Cowboys took Russell Maryland, and Rocket Ismail was an Argonaut. And the Globe had just come through some cuts at that time. They were really going through the calendar year for the first time about how to do this with a smaller staff. And they really hadn't assigned anybody to the Canadian Football League. So, here you had this huge story in Toronto, and it was, literally like, okay, kid, get out there and do that, and it turned into a phenomenal story, watching sort of the rebirth of the Argonauts that year and, covering the team right through the playoffs. And that was sort of where I really got my first, I guess, significant experience covering the CFL. After that, I went to the CBC for a little while, worked on a radio magazine show called The Inside Track for about 3 years. And then in 1994, I went to Saskatchewan with the CBC. And I don't have to tell you what you primarily cover when you're a sports reporter in Saskatchewan. It's all Rough Riders all the time. And so I did that in 94, 95, which was really fun, because covering the CFL in a place where it mattered as much as it does there. I kind of joke sometimes that people say, what's the biggest story you ever covered in your career? And I say, I don't know, might have been the day that the Rough Riders put Dave Ridgway on the practice roster. I'm joking a bit, but you can imagine like what a bleep storm that was, right? For a guy who was a legend, and he made the Grey Cup winning kick in 1988 and such. And his ending with the Rough Riders was kind of rocky and bumpy and kind of went public a little bit between him and the then coach, Ray Yacht. I left Saskatchewan in 95 after the first ever Grey Cup that was played there between the Baltimore Stallions and the Calgary Stampeders. And I took a little time off, and I resurfaced in Ottawa in 96, back in Ottawa for my second time. And that 1996 season, that was the first year after the collapse of U.S. expansion. So the league was in really tough straits. They had 3 teams go bankrupt that year: BC, Montreal, and Ottawa. David Braley bought the BC Lions and rescued them. Bob Wetnall bought the Montreal Alouettes and rescued them. And they couldn't find a buyer for the Ottawa Rough Riders. The Ottawa Rough Riders folded at the end of the 1996 season. And that was, I believe the Rough Riders had their roots going back to about 1883, but there had been so many close calls and so many public campaigns and so many rescues that people in Ottawa were just fatigued. It was almost like if you had an aging relative who you loved and had so much great experience with them, but they were so riddled with kind of disease and unable to function that it became a bit of a merciful passing when they died. It was almost like that with the football team. Even people who loved it were kind of like, yeah, I think it needs to go. It's that bad. I always remember the last ever Rough Rider home game, the game against Winnipeg, and the halftime show that day was the Shriners doing like a march. And I, not to be disrespectful to Shriners, but like the average age of a Shriner is up there. And we always talk about the CFL being sometimes not totally in sync with the younger generations. And that was kind of a symbolic way for them to go off. I know the Shriners do a lot of good work with, children with disabilities in hospitals. And I'm not trying to knock the Shriners, but a halftime show of Shriners marching from one end of the field to the other was not exactly, kind of in sync with where the league and its fan base needed to go. So it was a very sad time. I remember going in and buying stuff at the old Rough Riders store. I still have some of it in my office. Like people were just selling off everything. That 110-year-old franchise was gone, and that led to a lot of I during those years. Those are the only years I didn't cover the Canadian Football League really in my career, from about 1997 till 2000. There was no team in Ottawa. I was working as a freelance journalist then. I was doing a lot of different things. I was covering news. I was covering sports. I was covering a lot of hockey at that time. But I also covered city council in Ottawa at that time when there were a lot of debates about what they would do with the stadium. I mean, there was a lot of momentum to just demolish the stadium and build condos, do something that was going to bring in revenue, raise the tax base, all those kinds of things. And, the argument was such that, we don't want to, preserve this stadium just because some people have fond memories of the Rough Riders from the 1960s. That was certainly an argument that was going around. Of course, the team did come back as the Renegades in 2002. 4 seasons later, no playoff appearances, a lot of losses. They were gone again by the spring of 2006. So, I think a lot of us believed at that time that was it. I remember, Matt Sakaris, who covered the Renegades for the Ottawa Citizen, and up until earlier this week was the host of the Drive Show on TSN Radio in Vancouver. He's a good friend of mine, and I remember going to his apartment like the day after the Renegades folded, and we sat around and had a few drinks and just said, try to imagine how Ottawa CFL comes back. Like we really couldn't. Like we couldn't picture a world or a scenario where that would happen. With 2 teams folding in a decade, basically, or over 11 years, it really seemed hard to imagine. And then it did. And look, it was a long process. I think this from the first meeting they had about doing that until that team came into existence was about 7 years. And I'm going off the top of my head. It may have been longer than that. And to see the success that market has had, the way they've captured the younger demographic, when you go to a game in Ottawa, it's not a bunch of people from the Rough Riders days. It's a very new generation. I think in a weird way, not having the CFL for a number of years probably kind of cleansed the market a little bit, and just seeing the energy and how well that team has performed over that time as well. It's been really restoring, because I always thought Ottawa was a sleeping giant. For the CFL, I thought. Even when there was no team, it's a great football market. I mean, tons of players come out of Ottawa. The junior program is good. You got 2 good university programs, minor football. Like you look at guys that play in the NCAA and the CFL, there's tons of them from Ottawa. I always used to say to people, this is a good football market. And if you went in there and put a decent team on the field and ran the team well, I thought it had a lot of potential. And certainly, refurbishing the stadium was a big part of that as well, because it was a bit of a dump, and up until the Red Blacks came back. So, I lived through 3 generations of Ottawa football, and I always say as a journalist, I buried 2 teams. I'm confident, and I certainly hope I'll never have to bury a third.
And it's very interesting, the dynamic of Ottawa within the scope of Ontario itself, talking about football, because you were saying before, it's more like a Western city, or has an identity more similar to Winnipeg or Regina, where people associate very strongly with the local brand of Ottawa football. And you even talk about teams dissolving. The Carleton Ravens didn't have a football team for a long time until they had to come back, and they had to be built from the ground up again, despite the GGs having existed. So what was it about the team that caused them to go up and down? Because you very rarely see that, maybe with the exception of the Alouettes slash Concords that came from the Stallions, that much folding within one franchise. Why did Ottawa tinker, like go back and forth so much in such a short amount of time? And what
You
even
know,
made you want to bring him back?
I think it was. I mean, the fans were always there, right? And like I said, Ottawa's identity is a little more like a Western city, I think, because they really define themselves, by their city, not so much, their province, because they got Toronto in the same province, right? And that's there's a real definition there of the identity as there's a very strong kind of provincial be the wrong word, but a very local identity, strong city local identity in Ottawa. But in terms of why, I mean, the winning and losing doesn't dictate everything in sports, but it helps, right? You can't solve the problems of every franchise by winning. Some teams win and they still lose. Some teams lose and they still make tons of money. If you're the Chicago Cubs or the Toronto Argonauts, doesn't matter, or sorry, excuse me, the Toronto Maple Leafs, doesn't matter if you win. You're still going to make money, and then there are teams where, even winning doesn't solve. But if you look at the I used to know these numbers off the top of my head, but they basically went from like 1979, till 2015 without winning more games than they lost. That's a long time. Like if you think of the kind of bare bones standard for success in sports, we won more games than we lost. Okay. They never did that. Like in 92, the Rough Riders, I think, went 9-9. That was the high water mark. So for one, you're talking about a lot of losing football. Okay. That's the start, which leads to turnover in coaches, turnover in management, turnover in players. That's not good for fan engagement. And then you have the issue of ownership, right? I mean, the Gleibermans were there twice. Like I like Lonnie Gleiberman as a person. If I ran into him today, we'd go and have a coffee and get along well and have a nice conversation. But I thought he was a terrible sports owner. I thought he had bad instincts. I thought a lot of times what he thought was the right thing to do was dead wrong. And there were things off the field that hurt the credibility of the team. Certainly in their first go around in Ottawa with the Rough Riders, where they brought in Dexter Manley, right, who was washed up Super Bowl player from the Washington football team, showed up in Ottawa, wasn't in shape. They ordered a coach to play him. The coach refused and quit. Like when you got coaches resigning over being ordered by the owners to play a washed up NFL star, the fans look at it and say, sorry, why am I giving my money to these people? Like, why am I investing in this product? And again, consistent losing. They had in the late 80s, they signed a guy named Art Schlichter, who had been a Heisman Trophy candidate at Ohio State, big draft pick. He had a gambling addiction that had kind of taken his life sideways. That didn't work out. I mean, there were so many reinventions at the coach, reinventions at GM, reinventions at ownership, and none of them really had traction. And there is a limit, to how long people's patience will be when you're asking them for their money. So it was, I think there was just that whole, but people loved the idea of having a successful team. They just never did. And ultimately, you need somebody to invest and pay the bills. And in both those cases, the Gleibermans came in not because people thought they were necessarily the best people to run the team, but because they were the ones who would write the checks, right? That's why they came in the first time. And like I remember, I'll never forget this. When the Renegades were around, there was a story that Don Brennan wrote in the Ottawa Sun saying that the Gleibermans could be coming back to Ottawa as part of the ownership picture. Okay. Now I looked at that and thought, that seems a stretch. And I'm not saying Don Brennan made that story up, but it seemed like something that might have been a conversation, but it was not real. Like it wasn't really going to happen. There's all kinds of things we all write about that, hey, this is being talked about or this could happen. And whether it comes or not doesn't really mean the story that you wrote wasn't true, because you weren't saying it was going to happen. You were saying this could happen. And I thought this was one that had almost no hope. And I looked at it and I phoned Brad Waters, who then was the president of the team. And I said, what did you think of that Don Brennan column today? And he said back to me, well, Dave, somebody's got to pay the bills for this team. And I went, holy bleep. Like, like, hats off to Don Brennan. He got, and it was, I was like, holy smokes, like that's how desperate this situation is, and the Gleavermans were willing to come in and, they did some, again, not things that I would suggest doing, the Mardi Gras theme, deep discounting. Part of their business philosophy was no frills, like I love the no frills grocery store, stuff's cheaper. There's not all the fancy things you get at other grocery stores. It's not necessarily the biggest, brightest grocery store I've ever been in, but I like shopping at no frills. But I don't know if that works in professional sports. Their idea was no frills, like everything was just done on the cheap. And I think it was their way to try to manage the CFL's economics. Was we can cut costs. It's one way to do it. Grow revenue, cut costs. They were cost cutting. They did things like they sold a $99 season ticket, like for the year. Like you get a pass and you can go to games for $99. And they would have like a 3-day sale where you could buy a season pass to go to every game. This was something they had used at their ski lodge that they own. They had, they did this 3-day sale and you could get like a $99 season pass for the ski lodge or something. And I guess it worked in ski lodges, right? Because people who lived close by probably bought that and other people still came away and paid. But, in football, it really devalued your ticket, right? Like if I'm somebody who paid for a full season ticket, at $60 a ticket for a 10-game season, that's $600. And the guy next to me paid $99. And even if those seats were somewhere not as good, we all know people find ways into other sections and things like that. Especially if you're selling thousands of $99 seats, you're not going to be able to, it's hard to keep them all in those seats, especially if there are empty seats in other places. So things like that, they just were bad business practices. So there was just a lot of color, a lot of carnage, a lot of losing. And like again, people had an appetite and a patience to kind of restart and rebuild and do it again, but they just ran out of road in the end. It was really I used to say there are certain sports franchises that go a long time without winning, right? Like the Detroit Lions, for instance, right? The Cleveland Browns until recently, the Cleveland Indians in baseball for such a long time. When I was a kid and a teenager, I'd never seen a winning Cleveland Indians team. And then, the Ottawa CFL kind of became that story. I remember my friend Michael Farber, who used to write for Sports Illustrated. I remember having dinner with him at a Sens game one time in the lounge, and I said, "You guys should do a story, like a Sports Illustrated story, on the team that has the city that hasn't had a winning football season since 1979." So this would probably been about 2004, 2005. I said this to him, like it's unbelievable how bad they've been consistently, that they've never won more games than they lost. And Michael said to me, "You know what? We might do that. Send I don't remember whether I sent it to him or I sent it to an editor at Sports Illustrated, but I remember sending it. He said, put every big American name you can in your pitch, right? Because that would interest Sports Illustrated. Put Dexter Manley in there, right? Put Art Schleister in there. And there were other guys, who would come along at various times as well. Forrest Gregg, like things, whatever it happened to be. Anyone who would resonate with an American audience, throw that in the pitch. And they were interested. And then the Renegades folded. So we never did it. It was kind of I think Farber said, "I'll write it and you get paid for the idea." That was what he said to me. I said, "Okay, sounds like a good deal for me." And but we never did it. But that's kind of, that was the whole the history there,
It's so fascinating that a city like Ottawa could have a football team multiple times, but fail for such a long period. 70, like I know that they hadn't won the Grey Cup in 40 years when they finally
Right.
did in 2016, but I didn't know that it was similar to the Hartford Whalers performance in the sense that the Hartford Whalers never had a winning season, but that was only,
Right.
I think, 10 or 12 years or something. And they
Right.
brought in Gordie Howe and they were like really making a push for it and it never came
Sure.
through. And again, Hartford, different air, like Hartford, Connecticut versus Ottawa in Canada, right? Like the capital city of a
The
general.
9-team league, right? Like
how could you go wrong? I mean, I've had this discussion with my dad multiple times. People talking about bringing in more CFL teams, and obviously U.S. expansion is one of the main ones. But I've never had a conversation with someone else about this, and that the 10th team shouldn't be from Atlantic Canada, but why has the CFL not looked at putting a team in Quebec City because of Laval being there? If they had local players playing Quebec City, if it boosted the amount of sports year round, because obviously the Rockets only play during the hockey season. Have is that a crazy idea, or like why do you think the CFL has not looked at potentially going to Quebec? Is it because they're more focused on bringing the NHL back instead, or?
I think that the one thing you have to understand is that the process, even with Atlantic Canada, has not been the league going to Atlantic Canada and looking for people to own a team. It's been people who wanted to own a team in Atlantic Canada bringing it to the league, right? So it starts on the ground locally and then goes to the league, as opposed to the league, coming down and saying we want to have an expanded. You could do it that way, right? You could put out a feeler and say we want to expand to Quebec City. If you're interested, please let us know and see if you can flesh out an owner that way. But traditionally, the league has had other priorities, and in this most recent thing with Atlantic Canada, it was a group of businessmen. Frankly, one of them, who lives 50 yards from the stadium in Ottawa, and saw what happened there, right? Starting in 2014, and like really wanted to saw an expansion team kind of grow organically and have success, and thought, wow, why don't we do this in Halifax? And they found some political support there, from the mayor and the premier and that, and some support from the league as well behind it, because the 10th team would do, I think, wonderful things for the CFL. I'm a big advocate of the 10th team. Quebec City is tricky because, yes, football is very popular in Quebec, but if you look at the Rouge and Or's record over the last 25 years, how many losing seasons have they had? Like zero, right? Like they always win, because they're really, really invested in it. And they spend a lot of money on coaches and training and all those kind of things. So you're always going to be up against a winning team. So that's one thing. And you're also going to be up against a winning team that's full of French Canadian players, which really resonates with the populace there. So, how would a losing team full of, Anglophone Canadians and Americans do up against a winning team full of French Canadians? I think that's a dynamic that, as an outsider, I couldn't really say, but it would be a question I have, having watched the dynamics of sports in Quebec, from a relatively short distance over time. So that would be the first thing. You don't have a stadium there. I mean, you have a college stadium, but it's not CFL ready. And that's a big, you really, to be able to make a CFL team go, you got to have a modern stadium, be able to drive modern revenues out of that stadium. And I don't know how it would work with the RDS television deal with the Alouettes. I'm not completely familiar about how that works, but it would be something else you'd have to investigate and see, okay, well, how does that affect the Alouettes with the television rights and things like that? So those would be kind of the reasons why I think it hasn't happened. The other thing I think is that from a league and sponsorship perspective, when you're going to national companies and saying, why don't you do a deal with the CFL, there would seem to be some advantage of being able to say, we are in every region of the country. They're already in Quebec. They're in the biggest market in Quebec. Going to Quebec City, I'm not sure as a kind of national advertising platform, whether that does as much for the CFL as being able to plunk a team down to Atlantic Canada and say, here we are from BC to Atlantic Canada. We touch Canadians in all parts of the country. So that's why, I think the 10th team would be tremendous. I always joke, I always bring people to, this is one of those sort of refocus moments where I say, think about this, okay? In 1967, which is the year I was born, there were 6 NHL teams and 9 CFL teams. Think of that, right? Now there's 9 CFL teams and 32 NHL teams, with, you count Seattle. So, I mean, definitely the sports world has changed around the CFL. And if you wanted to talk about U.S. expansion, we could do a whole podcast on that, because I lived through that one. It was a bold venture. I'm not sure it was completely flawed in terms of an idea. It was very flawed in terms of an execution. But I don't think the league's going back there anytime soon.
And especially related to U.S. expansion, one of the things I've talked about with friends or my parents is about why wouldn't they put teams that are close to the border or places that will never get NFL teams, not way down in Shreveport, Louisiana. If you put a team in Montana or North Dakota, the NFL is never going to go there. And when you have a team that's close to the Canadian border, then the rivalry might have a possibility of it being stronger. And I like how you said it's not the idea is there, but the execution definitely seemed weak. And obviously, I was only born in '96, so I never existed to see the CFL expand to the US. But when looking back and studying the history, I think Ottawa, if I'm not mistaken, made the playoffs at 4-14 during the year that they expanded into the US. If I'm correct on that, I think it was one of those years that Ottawa were so bad, but there were so many US teams that were that much worse that they were able to make the playoffs.
Right.
The most obscene record. Like we thought that the Giants complaining at not making it at 6-10 was ridiculous. Try 4-14.
I assume you're correct on that, because there was some pretty funny things going on in those days with the divisions. Like at one point they were in an American division, other points they were in with the Canadian teams. But it was definitely an unusual time. And the early ideas for U.S. expansion, when they were presented by the league to the public, sort of, hey, this is what we're looking at doing, was exactly that. They were looking at markets like Portland, Oregon. People talked about places like Fargo, North Dakota. The whole idea was to kind of find cities in northern states that bordered Canada and were not potentially NFL markets. And then what happened is the ideology became, if the check clears. Right? I mean, the league was in really desperate straits in those days. They needed money. They needed injection of cash. So, if you were in Birmingham, Alabama, and you were willing to float them a check, I think the expansion fee was $3 million. You were in, right? And of those teams, Baltimore was the only one that really worked. Right? They caught a lot of momentum from the kind of anti-NFL backlash. Similar to what you saw in the XFL last year, where St. Louis was the only team that really drew well consistently because there was an anti-NFL sentiment there because of the Rams moving to LA. It was a very similar thing to Baltimore in '95, and of course, or '94, '95. Of course, late in the '95 season, they announced that the Cleveland Browns were coming to Baltimore, and all that changed. But it was a plan that was, put it this way: you try anything in life, if you do it from a point of desperation, your chances of being successful at it are probably a lot less than if you're doing it more, proactively and methodically and calculated. And the CFL was absolutely operating from a position of desperation at that time. And that's why I think, so many of the calculations they made, look, just a real simple one, right? We know that football and television go together, like pick your analogy. The CFL at that time was an ESPN2. I think most of the markets they were in did not have ESPN2 yet. Like it was kind of, coming out across the US, but there were markets where, people couldn't watch the games, and there were just things that were done so sort of fly by night and just hope and prayer. And, they had some success early in the season, but they had no answer, once they got to September and college football and the NFL started. And while those weren't college football, well, they all were college football markets, but while they weren't NFL markets, as you may have noticed, most people consume the NFL through television. So it doesn't matter, right? If the Dallas Cowboys are playing 1:00 on a Sunday and the Memphis Mad Dogs are playing at 3:00, everybody in Memphis is watching the Cowboys without having to go to the game. It's such a strong, powerful brand just through television that you have competition even when there isn't a team in the city where you are.
Yeah, that's one of the tough things about being in that scenario. Very curious to know, in terms of your career as you've navigated as a journalist, what are some of the main key points that you've learned across covering CFL teams that come and go, working in the political sector? How, as a journalist, have you navigated being in different landscapes, and what are some of the key things that you try to stay consistent on as you continue to cover football now that you're in a more stable environment, I guess I would say, with being an insider?
I guess I think the one consistent that I come to, and this is whether you're doing politics or news or football or anything, and whether you're doing it on Twitter or whether you're doing a 10-minute TSN feature with a big budget and travel and all that, or writing, everything in between. And it's one of the things I've been really lucky at is I've probably worked in more different ways than almost anybody in this country. I'm not the best at anything, but I've done more things probably than almost anyone working in sports in terms of, hosting, reporting, doing features, whatever the heck it might be. And I always try to remember that no matter what I'm covering or what medium I'm using, we're in the business of storytelling. So that's really what we do. We tell stories. And when I'm with my friends sitting around having beers, I get excited at the opportunity to tell a good story from what happened in my day or what happened last week or something on time. Like, wait till you hear this. Like, I love to do that. When I was in radio, I would see stuff and I would say, oh, I can't wait to tell that story on radio. And ultimately that's really what you're doing, and I think sometimes you get into it and you think you've got to, it's hard to sort of figure out. Sometimes you get into this world of whatever you're covering, there's so much going on around you, and it's hard to try to figure out, well, what should you write about, or what should you talk about, or whatever. And I always kind of go back to, well, if I was at this thing and I was meeting my friends at the end of the day, what would I tell them about this? What would I tell them about what happened at Rough Rider practice? What would I tell them about what happened at City Council? What would I tell them about the game that I covered? And that's really where my instincts kind of go, and I still, and then you got to have kind of a curiosity sometimes, right? Like, you got to know, sometimes just recognize the things that should draw your attention. And I had an experience this fall like that, where I spent a lot of time this fall on, doing something I don't do very often anymore because I'm usually so engaged with television. But with their no CFL season, I had a little more time, and I went back to kind of my writing roots. I wrote like a 6,000 word story on Joe, the receiver at Clemson, right? And all I knew when I started doing that was there was a kid of African background from Brooks, Alberta, who was a receiver at Clemson, like the #1 team in the nation. Now, I may not have the greatest news instincts in the world, but I was like, okay, if I start lifting rocks and branches on that story, I bet there's going to be stuff that comes out, because that doesn't just happen. You know what I mean? Like, so weirdly enough, my very first call on that story, I knew very little about this kid. And my very first call was, I completely blindly called the junior high principal in Brooks, Alberta. I just called the school, asked to talk to the principal. I told him who I was, told him who I worked for, and I said, do you know this kid? And he knew him. He knew everything. Like, he basically had been I got lucky that he'd been like a community football coach, right? He basically recruited him to play football when he was in grade 3. But he not only knew everything about a Joe, he knew everything about everybody else who would know. This is who knows the family story. This is who knows how he got recruited to play high school in Edmonton. This is who knows his basketball background. This is who knows how, when he went to Florida. This, like, and all of a sudden, by the time I was done, and that was one of the most, I said, that was one of the most tremendous stories, just as a story. That was one of the most tremendous stories I've come across in like almost 30 years in this business. I mean, Joe's mother was raised in a refugee camp in Africa, like, and his story, coming, it was a real twist on, and then I learned out of that the story of Brooks, Alberta, which had been basically an all-white town of 10,000 people that in a period of like a very short number of years became a town of 14,000 that was basically 1/3 minority, like in the middle of Alberta. And so I couldn't tell the story of a Joe without telling the story of Brooks, Alberta and its transformation. I couldn't tell the story of a Joe with writing about the Sudanese Civil War, which is what had landed his family in a refugee camp in Africa. And all of a sudden, like, just, you see what I mean? It's like your instincts, you go, okay, kid from Brooks, Alberta, African background, made it to Clemson as a receiver. It's all I know. But if I'm any good as a journalist, I'm going to find a story here. And I just found one of the greatest stories I've ever come across. So I use that because it's a recent example, right? You just keep your radar on, right? And find the right people and ask the right questions. And you're a storyteller. I had so much fun telling that kid's story. It was one of the more interesting stories I've ever had a chance to do. And the great thing about it is he's like 18, 19 years old. So he's going to be around for a long time, I hope. I think he's got a decent shot to play in the National Football League, given his attributes and where he's playing. And I may be writing about a Joe for a long time, but one of the things I wanted to do was be the guy in Canada who knows everything about this kid.
So you talk about going to hang out with your friends and saying, okay, well, what would I tell them about the game, or what would I tell them about practice? I find that
Mhm,
such a fascinating way to really describe that natural instinct and curiosity
mhm,
that people have to tell stories, and that it's more
mhm.
than just let me follow the same boring formula. It's okay,
Yeah,
well, what would get you really excited? So
yeah.
I guess in terms of choosing why you went to Carleton, then I would maybe assume correctly that that curiosity went hand in hand with knowing, well, if I could tell stories for a living, then I'm laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, I think it's you kind of you try to find something that you want to do that kind of naturally goes with like you do. Like I honestly I love to tell stories in front of my friends. Like I love to entertain, a small group of people with stories of stuff that happens to me. And I don't know why, but somehow I have a life that has a lot of kind of, man, I can't believe that happened to you kind of stories. Like I do. I always have. I just have always had a life that sometimes I wonder whether I attract this stuff or not. Um, that's been so I've always had that kind of natural thing. But it really it's funny because when I went to journalism school, I didn't really know that, right? And I thought that when you went to cover something, your job was to cover everything that happened there. Like, if you went to a school board meeting, God knows I've actually done that to cover it. Like I say, I mentioned, you asked me about my career. Like there was 4 years where I was a freelancer, right? And I covered a lot of sports, a lot of hockey, but I did a lot of anything. Like when I was in my early 30s, I was covering school board meetings for the CBC and stuff like that, which is not was ever on my career goals, but it, get paid the bills. But if you go to a school board meeting, I used to think that you're going to report everything that happened there. That's your job to be like a stenographer. Just here's what happened. Or if you went to a football game, you're going to tell everybody everything that happened. And then I realized, no, that's not your job. Your job is to pull out the thing that people would find interesting. And that's become more and more a part of sports reporting because like when I was at the Globe and Mail, I did a lot of game stories, right? Like I wrote Senators for 7, 8 years, right? A lot of game stories. I wrote CFL, a lot of game stories. And the thing has become that, you know, television and the expansion of sports on television has been such that most people have seen the game you're writing about. They don't need to be told that, Ottawa scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter and had an interception before halftime. They saw it, right? So it's been way less about telling people what happened and way more about trying to tell a story out of what happened. And I think that's really the changes in the exposure of sports, um, and the availability of people to get news on their own has, in terms of what actually happened, has shifted it more on storytelling or analysis. And analysis is really just kind of another form of storytelling, right? Hey, they signed so and so today. What do you think? Well, I think this could be advantageous because this guy was down last year and they really feel like they need somebody to back up his position. And you're just filling in, people get the news headline. Your job is to kind of, tell the story because again, you think about it, everything that happens in sports, trade, signing, firing, okay, those are basically things that go around the calendar all the time. When I see a player is traded, somebody's fired, somebody's cut, somebody's signed, my job is to get on Sports Center and tell people what's the story behind that. Like, what's the story? Why did that happen? And sometimes I know a lot about it before it happens and I can just do it like that because I've been following it. And other times I got to get on and start texting and phoning people and trying to learn the story. But that's just storytelling. That kind of analysis is just storytelling.
And I guess I would go hand in hand with the story that happened today, JJ Watt getting released, or the team
Right.
decided to mutually part ways with them. Now people saying, talking to Texans fans or talking to people who are following the league, it's like, well, what does this mean for Deshaun Watson? If Watt was able to walk just like that, do they do the whole hold him hostage like Le'Veon Bell thing until he eventually gets traded for nothing, or do they mutually agree to part ways as well? That's the different story that I'm sure people down
Yeah,
in the US and or all across the US, even Canada, are just they're digging for
exactly.
what's going
Because
on.
people are looking at two players that wanted out, right? And one got a free pass and one didn't. And without having dug into that story very far, because I did read about it this morning, certainly, I right off the top of my head, I would say one guy's at the beginning of his career, one guy's at the end, right? One guy I don't know if JJ Watt's worth $17.5 million anymore. Okay. Per season. And if he's not, and that's the contract that you've got him on, then he's untradeable, right? Because nobody's going to take that contract on. And then there's probably also a goodwill element to that. That JJ Watt has been such a soldier for that franchise, not just that franchise, but that community, that they probably, feel a debt of gratitude to him and want to allow him to go to wherever he wants. And the only way you can do that is by setting him through a free agency. So again, I'm speculating on that. I don't know. If I was an NFL reporter who was trying to break that story, those are the things that I would look at. Like I'd have an idea in my head. Like it's not totally mysterious to me, right? Like some people would look at it and say, what the heck? This guy this and this guy that. That's not the way I'm reacting to it. I see they're totally different contexts around them. So I would dig into that story already having a pretty good idea of the different dynamics that are around Deshaun Watson and JJ Watt.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you mentioned those things, because people, I don't know, that I've already seen have been kind of confused as to saying, why would they release Watt? Oh my goodness, et cetera, et cetera. And you're like, well,
it's emotional, right? That's
yeah,
an emotional thing. JJ Watt is an emotional thing. And sports fans are supposed to be emotional, but sports executives are not. Right? If you make emotional decisions in sports, you will be out of a job, right? And that's one of the things. And the other part of it is in terms of modern reporting sports, you have to understand economics. Like I don't have a degree in economics at all. I never studied economics, but I learned sports economics from being around it through osmosis and on the fly. And I found that was a big part of what was missing in a lot of people's confusion about why the CFL didn't play this year when the NFL, the NHL, and the NBA, Major League Baseball did, right? There was all this, oh my God, like how come we're not playing, right? And you're right, it does come down to money, but it comes down to money in a way that's a little more sophisticated than the way people think of it, right? And I'll try and give you a quick explanation, okay? If I own the San Diego Padres and they're worth $1.3 billion, and my owners and my league doesn't have any fans this year, but we're going to play, okay? And the league comes to me and says, it's going to cost you $40 million for us to play. I look at it and say, well, my asset is worth 1.3 billion. Okay. So if I've got to spend $40 million for us to play this year, that's about a 3% investment in my team to keep us playing, keep us in front of the TV, keep the fans engaged. And oh, by the way, I own this asset like straight out. So I can get a very, very low interest loan for $40 million if I need it, by just showing the bank my piece of paper that says I own the San Diego Padres, right? So boom, boom. As a business decision, it's a no-brainer, okay? If I own the Ottawa Red Blacks and they come to me and say, if we play this season without fans, it's going to cost every team, 12 to $15 million or 10 million or whatever. And my team is only worth 12 to $15 million. Now we're talking about making 100% investment based on the value of my franchise, where the guy who owns the San Diego Padres is making a 3% investment. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's very few people kind of stand back and look at that, right? And just say, I don't care if you had a bake shop or you're selling vacuum cleaners. If you had to spend as much as your business is worth to stay open, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any business sense. Now, there may be a point this year where they say, you know what, guys, we got to do it because we can't be gone for 2 years. And the league, and all our franchises are going to be in jeopardy, and this may not make economic sense, on a 1 year basis. But we got it. Like, I don't know. But the point is that you can't look at any decision in sports, and I mean almost any decision in sports, without studying the economics behind it. It really, and I know that's not the way fans want to look at that, because their lives are based on economics, paying their rent, figuring out their jobs and all that. They just want to go enjoy games and sports and all that. But sports is business, and almost everything that happens in it, has some degree of, an economic component about it. And a lot of them are all economics. So that's the other thing that kind of I've learned in terms of covering sports, is that you always have to think of the money, and that is usually a big part of the story. And in the course of, in the course of JJ Watt, again, his salary would be the one that would be the most obvious, right? I don't know. I haven't studied him enough this past year to know whether he's still a $17.5 million football player. But, we know he's at the end of his career. And if he's not, then, that's that makes his contract untradeable.
You're 100% correct. And I think that's one of the things that the hard pill I've had to swallow as a sports fan over the last several years is when you grow up as a kid, you don't want to see your favorite player leave. And JJ Watt, it's a perfect example. He is an emotional icon. People look at him and say, good man, serves the community, raises money for the Hurricane Harvey disaster, et cetera, et cetera. He's such a good person. He pours his heart and soul out every time that I think it was after the week 16 game or whenever he gave that speech, people were like, wow, like, I applaud you. What a great person. But people don't see, well, he's worth X amount. And if they let him, et cetera, then they get to clear cap space. Or I guess as personally as a Jacksonville Jaguars fan, which I know you may be thinking that's really strange.
It is.
You look at the 2017 team. Okay, it makes sense. They're doing really well. And then the next year, guys start to walk, they start releasing people. They let Fournette go, all these things. And everyone's like, well, that doesn't make sense. And et cetera, et cetera. And they're just, this is so stupid. And why are they making these decisions? It's like, well, they were turning into a dumpster fire. They have all sorts of players that have bloated contracts, guys that are starting to age, and they're basically taking one-shot wonders in the dark, hoping that it's all going to come together. And when it doesn't, then you have to kind of go your separate ways. Or like the Brooklyn Nets when they brought in Pierce Garnett, like at the very end of their career. Okay, sure, you win a playoff series, but now that's as far as you're going to go. Now you have to walk, and now you have to do all. So there's so many examples. The Rams trading for Stafford, et cetera, all these things that are driven by business decisions and economics you talk about.
And in the case of the CFL, it's just a different economy of scale, right? Like when you look at the few years ago when Chris Jones went in there and like started letting Weston Dressler go and other very popular Rough Riders, right? People freaked out, Chris Jones's ego and stuff like that. No, I'm sure he went in, looked at those players' production, looked at what they were due to make, probably projected what they were going to be into the future and said, if we want to win, we got to move on. And that's hard for fans to swallow that stuff, right? Because they grow attached. And I've seen football coaches that I thought were partially successful because they never grew attached to anyone, like Don Matthews. Don Matthews would cut his son, like it would the minute there was a guy who was better and cheaper, bang, like he would drop the trap door under him. And everybody in this locker room knew it. That's why guys performed for him partially, because they knew that Don was the least sentimental coach in the history of football. And the minute they couldn't perform, it didn't matter what they'd done. He was gone. They were gone. And I've seen the opposite. I've seen guys that I thought got too close to players, became too, attached to them and what they'd done in the past. And I mean, you saw that with the Dallas Cowboys in the 90s. I mean, they won a couple of Super Bowls and signed everybody for like 5 more years. And all of a sudden, they weren't any good anymore. They fell in love with their golden era and tried to extend it beyond. So, that's another part of it. Is like I say, fans are supposed to be emotional. Executives, when they get emotional, it doesn't work. And that's exactly what you're saying. But that's why you have to kind of, and the NFL makes it that much harder because their cap is not easy to understand. Right? It doesn't, like, again, I've been around football a long time. I still have to have, a lot of elements of the NFL cap explained to me because it's not as simple as the NHL's cap or the CFL's cap at all. It's way more complicated in terms of the way it's done. So that makes it that much more difficult for fans to digest.
Yeah, you mentioned Don Matthews, who's coached a handful of the guests I've had on the pod, and Ben Cahoon talking about how great of a coach Don Matthews was in terms of his ability to let veteran players rest, relax, having those I guess innovative, unique styles. But again, my modern day example growing up as a kid was Wally Buono, right? Yeah. Oh, you're hurt, or oh, you can't produce for us? Okay, see ya.
And when Wally would often let good players go once they were no longer getting better. Like, if you think of the arc of a player, right? Here's a guy, as soon as he starts doing that, right? Even though he's still a good player, like, going down the other side of the hill, you can still be a good player. But as soon as they would cross that arc and start going down, that was his signal to move on a guy, even if he was still a productive player. Your asset is diminishing. That's the thing about football is that, there's an ascension and then there's kind of a diminishing quality. And that's why it can be a really abrupt business when you throw in the fact that they don't guarantee contracts and teams just walk away from guys at the drop of a hat.
Well, Dave, we're getting towards the end of our time here in today's episode. I want to wrap up with a few more, I guess, quick questions. Sure. More a rapid fire round based on some of your knowledge and and
Hmm.
quirky stories that you've
Hmm.
experienced in your
Sure.
time as a journalist. So the first question I have is, who is the most memorable player you ever watched up close that played for any Ottawa franchise?
Let's see, for any Ottawa franchise, the most memorable player. Yeah, I mean, I would think if you're talking for any Ottawa franchise in any sport, you know, it was probably Daniel Alfredson, because I thought he was a fourth round draft pick, like he was not a guy that was high on the radar. Um, there were so many changes around him during his years with the Senators. There were ownership changes, there were coaching changes. Well, not many coaching changes, but certainly management changes. Um, and they were consistently good. And he was the kind of one staple. I thought he's probably the most remarkable Ottawa athlete I ever watched, game in, game out, season in, season out. And like, I don't know if he's a Hall of Famer, but he played consistently well at a very high level for a very long time, and as a kind of undersized guy. And again, not a guy who was the fourth overall pick of the draft, right? I believe he was a fourth rounder. So I would probably say Daniel Alfredson. Yeah.
Most memorable sporting event you've covered in your career?
You know what? This one is easy to answer because it will surprise people. A first round college basketball NCAA game between Vermont and Syracuse in 2005. when uh, when when the NHL lockout happened in 2005, we had money to spend and plates to fill, and I got to cover March Madness for the one and only time in my career. And I got sent to Worcester, Massachusetts, and there was a first round game between Syracuse and Vermont. And that year, like Syracuse, I think Shaquille O'Neal picked them to make the Final Four, right? And they're a good team, and they played. And Syracuse, plays in 35,000 seat, venue in their dome, and they've produced zillions of NBA players. They've had Jim Boeheim, who's been there forever, and they played Vermont, that had never won an NCAA tournament game, never produced an NBA player, never beat a top 25 team in their history. Like in 110 years, none of those things had ever happened. And the game started to happen, and Vermont got up, and I thought, oh my God, like you could just feel this energy in the building that I'd never felt before, right? And all of a sudden I realized, like, this can't happen in pro sports. There's not enough of an underdog for this to happen in pro sports, right? Because everybody's millionaires and everyone's got a franchise, and the playing field's always a little bit level. And I started, and somebody in the crowd screamed late in the game, "Do you believe in miracles?" Which was the line that Al Michaels used, when the U.S. beat the Russians. And I thought, my God, this is what this feels like. And I was completely blown away by the energy in that building when people started to believe that could actually happen. And then the game went to overtime, and I thought, they're gonna, how it's gonna end in overtime, right? Because their bench isn't as deep as that. And anyway, and they won. And I've never felt anything like that in my life in all the events I've covered. And it was funny that the coach of Vermont at that time, whose name escapes me, I'm going to think of it right now. But anyway, after the post game news conference, he was asked what he thought when the game went to overtime. And I thought, okay, here comes the cliche, right? I never stopped believing in my guys. I told my guys, this is our moment of destiny. I knew we were going to win that game. This was our special. You know what he said? He goes, when we went to overtime against Syracuse, I thought we were done. And I love that. Like that he actually confessed that he thought they were done. And they won that game. And then I think they played Michigan State next, and they lost. They didn't go past the first round. But that is the single most exciting sporting event I've ever covered.
What would you tell your younger self?
And by the way, I covered 14 Super Bowls, like 13 of them that came down to the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. So,
Oh my God.
So there's a pretty high bar.
Wow. I didn't even know about that game, but I'm going to go look that up after this right now. But the next question is, what would you tell your younger self from the present day to young Dave starting his career as a journalist?
Be patient. Always keep learning. Find good role models and find out how they do their jobs and learn from them. And keep in mind that it's always about storytelling. That would be that. And I think you probably imagine I get a lot of emails and texts from people in journalism schools that want those kinds of advice. And that's the kind of thing I tell them, right? Um, know what you are, know what you're not is another thing, right? We all have different skill sets in this business, and kind of know what not your brand so much, but really what's your identity as a journalist? What do you do? What do you do well? What kind of stories do you like to tell? But those would be the things I'd put on that list.
The final question I have for you is, if you were to choose any other career besides working in journalism and covering sports, what would it be and why?
It's really interesting, and I've never had to cross that bridge. I went for an interview in about 1997 with a high tech company in Ottawa, when I was freelancing, right? Like, in freelancing can be a really tough business. You have good weeks, good months, bad months, but it's hard. You're constantly working to find work. And I went for an interview for a high tech company, which was, one of these up and comers that in the boom of that time. And they were going to send me all over and this stuff. And I went to the interview and I put on a suit. And as I drove home, I felt like I wanted to cry. It was like, practically the right thing to do would have been to take that job. But in my heart and soul, I felt like it wasn't what I wanted to do. Right. This is all I've ever wanted to do. And I'd been successful at it, but the market had turned, and I didn't have a full-time job. And I mean, that ended up being a bit of a gift, right? Because I had to work in radio, TV, and writing at the same time to survive. And that became, by accident, great preparation for the world that was coming. I didn't know it at the time, right? I love to say that in the late 90s, I did all three because I knew that was going to be a skill set that would be valued, but it really was accidental. It was more survival that I ended up like that. And so I didn't get the job, so it was great. But I don't know. I've thought about it because I think, as we've seen this week, nobody's job is safe in this business. You could be really good at what you do and be somewhere a long time, and just like economics, same thing that happens to players sometimes, turns against you. Doesn't mean you're not good at what you do. So like something, there's a practical element of it, right? You have to pay your bills and do that. But if I could do anything of what I could do, I might want to like write a screenplay or something, like try to, I've had ideas like that kick around in my head, some of them related to sports, some not. I love to travel, and I know the world's not traveling right now, but maybe something travel oriented or something like that. I've always been a little bit curious about what it would be like to be on the other side doing the sports PR, like the messaging for teams, and trying to basically get journalists to write and say what we want them to say, because I've always been on the other side of that fence, right? So sometimes I've thought, man, what would that be like to be the guy who's trying to, figure out how to tamp down a brush fire, when something goes wrong or something like that. So all those things have kind of gone through my head. But I really haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, because I've been lucky enough to be able to do what I wanted for, in May, it'll be 30 years. So I've been really lucky.
Oh, wow. I mean, I know that it ages you a bit, but still, like, it looks like haven't aged a bit from all the years you've been covering football and doing such a good job at it, and being able to create and generate that excitement around covering different sports, or whether it's school board meetings for the CBC.
It's I've done, like I said, I've a wide spectrum of things I've had an opportunity to do.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you so much for having been on today's episode. It was an absolute pleasure, and I really enjoyed being able to talk football with you, and also about your career in journalism.
Well, I appreciate it. They're really thoughtful questions, and I've done a lot of these things off and on, and some I enjoy more than others, and I really enjoyed this one today. So thanks for having me.
Well, I really appreciate that. That means a lot. And everyone, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of CFL Insider Dave Naylor.